Welcome back everyone to part 2 of my EverQuest Lore, the Ruins of Kunark series. In the last video we looked at the rise and the fall of the Sebulisian Empire. Today we are going to look at the aftermath and how we got to the point where the Ruins of Kunark expansion kicks off. In the first episode we started out with the Shisar enslaving the Iksar and then being wiped out by the Green Mist. Then we followed the rise and fall of the Sebulisian Empire, starting with its founder, Venril finding the unholy writ of war and using it to conquer the 5 Iksar tribes and unite them. We saw Venril attempt to gain immortality, but instead get killed by his son Ryle, who took over as emperor and ruled with an iron fist. Ryle built Kern's Tower and the site that is known today as Kessera, and invaded Fadewar, only to see Trakannon defy the Ring of Scale and sink his fleet. We saw Atrib Sathir create twisted abominations, combining Dragon with Froglock and Iksar to fight for the Sebulisian Empire as the Ring of Scale fought amongst themselves. Atrib tested these elite troops against the Giants, ultimately wiping them out and enslaving what remained of them. Atrib's untimely death paved the way for Gannik Sathir to take control of the army his father created and attack the Ring of Scale with force, and then die above the Field of Bone in a heroic fight where he felled the great Jalad Dar. And lastly, we saw the Ring of Scale deal the final blow to the Sebulisian Empire, killing Chotal, the child emperor who reigned only for a day, ending the Sathir line. And that brings us to where we left off. It is the year 530 AG, and the 54-year war between the Sebulisian Empire and the Ring of Scale has just ended. The war was devastating on both sides. The Ring of Scale retreated to Vishan's Peak to renew their manipulations, and the line of Sathir had ended with the death of Chotal. The end of the line of emperors, coupled with the destruction of the Iksar armies, signaled an end to the Sebulisian Empire. With the death of Chotal and the end of the Sathir line, the Iksar attempted to salvage what was left of their empire by turning to a council of elders to lead them, in place of an emperor. The Iksar would call this council the Emerald Circle, and they would be comprised of one noble selected from each of the 5 Iksar tribes that existed before Venril Sathir unified them into his empire. This would allow for equal and fair representation by each of the tribes. The Emerald Circle began to preside over what appeared to be a period of peace on Kunark. But appearances can be deceiving, and on Kunark, peace is almost always an illusion. Following their last vengeful strike at the Imperial Palace that wiped out the last of the Sathir dynasty, the Ring of Scale retreated to Vishan's Peak, where they sealed themselves away and took their time to recover. One could make the argument that the Ring of Scale won the war against the Iksar, but their losses were significant. The Ring of Scale were no longer willing to risk direct combat. The dragons were not seen or heard from for several hundred years outside of rumors of their agents lurking in the shadows, sowing mistrust among the Iksar. For a time, the Emerald Circle worked to stabilize the Iksar Empire and put it back on the path to prosperity. The fleet that had been destroyed by Trakannon and his followers so many years earlier was rebuilt, and trade with other continents was re-established. However, any stability that appeared to exist within the Emerald Circle was superficial and short-lived. Almost as soon as it was convened, rifts began to form in its leadership. Fights over land, slaves, and influence within the council were common and were frequently linked to unseen figures, sinking their claws into Iksar politics from the shadows. Rifts within the council would lead to conflict between the tribes, and those conflicts would inevitably lead to civil war, and in a few short years the Iksar once again found itself split into 5 warring states, each with a fraction of the power that they held as a cohesive empire. What followed was a time of chaos and war amongst the Iksar. Tribe fought against tribe, noble family fought against noble family, and all the while agents from the Ring of Scale stoked the conflict from the shadows. Many tried to claim the title of emperor during this time, but none had the strength to hold it. This time of chaos culminated in 1056 AG, when a series of violent earthquakes rocked the continent of Kunark. What remained of the once dominant Iksar Empire crumbled. Ancient cities fell into the oceans, merchant ships were capsized by tsunamis, commerce and trade ground to a halt, and the Iksar of Kunark were isolated. In all of the chaos, another threat was unleashed and snapped the final thread that was holding the Iksar together. The earthquakes had damaged the magical prison built by Jaled Dar centuries ago, and after 600 years, Trakannon and his followers broke free from their prison. The pent-up hate and vengeance that Trakannon held within him in that prison was unleashed against a continent that was in no position to resist it. Trakannon and his followers swept across the lands, leveling what remained of the great Iksar cities, burning everything in their path. They descended on the west wood that surrounded Charduk and left nothing but char and ash. The destruction by dragonfire was so widespread that a cloud of smoke covered Kunark for an entire year, blocking out the sun. Crops failed, and starvation strangled the races of Kunark. Desperate from starvation, the Froglux giants and even the loyal Sarnak saw the weakness of the Iksar, and they all rose up in revolt against their masters. The Iksar struggled to maintain control for a time, but failed. The goblins of Fadewar also received word that the Iksar had fallen, and they sent war parties to Kunark to plunder and kill as payback for the years the Iksar spent plundering Fadewar. The goblin Kabaktak oversaw the building of a city in the Warslick's woods and crowned himself king of the Kunark goblins. The tower built for Karakitis in Warslick's woods was crumbled by giants, who also overran Castle Karnor, leaving it in ruins as well. Faradar, daughter of Jaled Dar, and the Ring of Scale see the damage being done to the lands of Kunark by Trakannon and demand that he cease his attacks and return to Vaishon's Peak. All of the younger dragons that followed him opted to return to the Ring of Scale, facing death or permanent banishment if they did not, but Trakannon refused. He swore that he would not rest as long as Iksar survived, and he fled to the ancient city of Sebelis. There he freed the Froglux slaves, who took the city for themselves and now guard Trakannon, who lives deep in the caverns below it. The Iksar were forced out of the last of their cities to hide in the jungles, where they were systematically hunted and killed by their many enemies. Iksar were killed en masse by uprising slaves and dragon attacks, and they were almost completely wiped out. What was left of the Iksar fled to a place called Kabalis between the swamplands and the Field of Bone, and hid there to try and salvage what remained of the Iksar race. For nearly 700 years at this point, there is a group that has remained hidden on Kunark. Through the most prosperous years of the Sebelisian Empire, through the wars with the Ring of Scale, through devastation, famine, and revolt, through earthquakes and upheaval of the very continent itself, this group has remained hidden, biding its time and searching for the relics that it needs to carry out its plan. The cult of the Arisen was founded by Avengane, dark priest and trusted advisor to Venril Sathir. It was Avengane who betrayed Venril Sathir and told his son Ryle of his plans to become immortal. It was Avengane who used his magic to teleport Ryle and his loyalists deep into his secret lair where he was performing his ritual, and gave Ryle the knowledge to disrupt it. It was Avengane who watched as Ryle destroyed Venril Sathir's body and claimed the title of Emperor for himself. Avengane was content to let Ryle take all of the power for himself in that moment. All he wanted in return for his role in the betrayal was the amulet Venril wore during the ritual, and an Iksar skin-bound book that he kept with him at all times. Avengane vanished that day with the amulet containing Venril Sathir's soul and the unholy writ of war, and in secret he founded the Cult of the Arisen. The cult broke into the sealed city of Charasis, where Drusilla Sathir had been entombed, and built a secret lair beneath the abandoned city. There they began to lay out their plan to use Venril's phylactery and the unholy writ of war to bring Venril Sathir back as a lich under their control, who they would use as a puppet to rule the Empire. All they needed was a body to host Venril Sathir's soul. The body of Ryle Sathir. Their plan to kill Ryle and use his body to complete the ritual was unexpectedly thwarted, however, when Trakannon sunk Ryle's armada in 406 AG. Ryle's remains were lost at the bottom of the timorous deep. But that was not the end of the Cult of the Arisen. They would wait, guarding the phylactery and the book in the depths of Charasis for 6 centuries, until fate would see the remains of Ryle Sathir recovered. With the Iksar fleet wiped out, the timorous deep is open to explorers and salvagers hunting for treasure amongst the wreckage of the Battle of the Timorous Deep. One explorer discovered the corpse of Ryle Sathir outfitted in armor and jewelry in the wreck of the fetid plank. He brought the corpse back to Kunark whole, where he sold it to the goblin king Kabaktok, who displayed it as a trophy in his throne room. Kabaktok would tell visitors to his throne room that he defeated Ryle Sathir in personal combat, and kept his body as a reminder to others not to cross him. While the Iksar slowly rebuilt in Kabalis, war raged between the once enslaved races who were now free from Iksar tyranny. The Froglucks pushed back into their ancestral home in the swamps of Kunark, while the goblins and giants fought each other for territory. The goblins took Castle Karnor from the giants, and the giants sacked the goblin city in Warslick's woods, killing the goblin king. Farslick, king of the giants and descendant of the great warlord Warslick, captured the remains of Ryle Sathir for himself when the goblin city was plundered, and took it back to the fortress mine of Connachor in the frontier mountains. Connachor was then taken by the goblins briefly before being retaken by the giants in the same year. The remains of Ryle changed hands again as they were plundered by the goblins and sold to a black market Iksar merchant called Vlistus. Vlistus had connections, and was able to track down a member of the one group who sought after the remains of Ryle Sathir more than any other, the Cult of the Arisen. The cult had dispersed across Kunark centuries earlier to search for any sign of the remains of Ryle. Now that the remains were in their possession, word was sent out, and the descendants of the Cult of the Arisen returned to Charasis. Charasis had fallen into ruin over the centuries, and the cult took to the task of excavating the ruins to find the lost phylactery. After 50 years of searching, the altar and phylactery were found, and the cult was ready to summon Venril Sathir to serve them. They gathered with the unholy writ of war in hand and performed the dark rites over the altar. But nothing happened. The ritual did not work. Believing their chance had passed, and there was no way they could summon Venril Sathir, the cult abandoned the amulet and bones on the altar and left Charasis. Elsewhere in Kunark, the Sarnak were growing into an empire of their own based in Charduk. They expanded outwards, establishing mines in the frontier mountains and outposts throughout Kunark. During their expansion, the Sarnak opened Charasis in hopes of learning from the libraries that are said to be hidden there. A Sarnak priest found the altar with the unholy writ of war, the amulet, and Ryle's remains still on it, and unknowingly completed the ritual. After 1,600 years of being conscious and trapped in an amulet, Venril Sathir's soul is pulled into the remains of his treacherous son Ryle, and he rises from his long slumber. He immediately kills all but one of the Sarnak in Charasis and converts the last one into a vampire to do his bidding. For the next 100 years, Venril and his vampire companion wandered Kunark from destroyed Iksar City to destroyed Iksar City, amassing a following. They wound up in the Dreadlands at the ruins of Castle Karnor, and they set to rebuilding it. From their new fortress in Karnor, Venril Sathir begins sending out raiding parties. Along with Thuga, one of his followers and a powerful Iksar wizard, Venril transforms mortal creatures into an army of lycanthropes to guard Karnors. The dragons of the Ring of Scale received word that a new power was rising in the Dreadlands. Many of them were old enough to remember the power of Venril Sathir and how he was able to build an empire. They decided that he must be stopped. Ring of Scale agents began whispering to the goblins and giants that there was a dangerous force growing in Castle Karnor that needed to be stopped. Agents of Scale convinced the giants that Venril Sathir planned to eliminate them utterly so they could never return as a threat to him, and they were convinced that they must seek the help of the goblins at all costs to aid in their assault on Venril Sathir's forces. The giants approached the goblins and offered them the mines and fortress of Kunark in return for forming an alliance to take Castle Karnor. The Alliance of Stone was formed between the giants and goblins, and they began to plan their attack. The Agents of Scale also got into the ear of Thuga, Venril Sathir's wizard and loyal servant. Thuga saw himself as the father of the lycanthropes and cared deeply for them. The Ring of Scale convinced him that Venril Sathir saw them as disposable and planned to eliminate them as soon as their usefulness had passed. This drove Thuga to secretly join the Alliance of Stone and assist the goblins and giants in their attack on Karnor. Thuga revealed the weaknesses of Venril Sathir's fortifications, and with his help the Alliance of Stone marched on Karnor in secret to attack with the element of surprise. The Ring of Scale had grown wary of any one power growing too strong in Kunark, however, so at the last moment their agents warned Venril Sathir of the impending attack, and he was able to signal the defenses. The resulting siege of Karnor lasted an entire year, and with heavy losses, the Alliance of Stone was able to force Venril Sathir and what remained of his followers out and into the swamplands, where he would build the outpost Varys. Now that the threat of Venril Sathir was dealt with, the Ring of Scale took to ending the Alliance of Stone. They convinced the goblins that the giants planned to go back on their word and not deliver Kunark as payment for the alliance. At the same time, they convinced the giants that the goblins planned to take Kunark by force and then push farther into the giants' territory, taking their other mines and settlements as well. The resulting war, called the War of Lies, would last 30 years and see the goblins and giants crippled by the fighting. While the goblins and giants fought, the Sarnak Empire built settlements in the frontier mountains and captured several mines from the goblins. They began to tame wild Sokakor to once again use them in battle, but this time in the name of their own Daizok Empire rather than in service to the Iksar. The goblins and giants were too busy fighting amongst themselves to defend the fort they had just taken in the Dreadlands, so Venril Sathir and his followers quietly moved back in and began raising an army of undead to fight for him. While all of this was happening, a party of High Elves set foot on Kunark for the first time and attempted to build a settlement. Constant attacks from Froglock raiders pushed them back, and they were forced to return to Fador to regroup. The High Elves made 2 more attempts to land and establish an outpost, but were forced out by giants both times. Finally, years later, they returned in force and built a fortified outpost that could withstand the constant raids by the giants and Froglocks. The giants and a group of lycanthropes that fled from Karnor years earlier formed an alliance to keep the High Elf settlement at bay. The High Elves were quickly joined by a growing number of adventurers of other races, primarily dwarves and humans. While the High Elves were establishing an outpost at what would later be known as Firiona Vai, the Dark Elves were establishing an outpost of their own in the Overthere. Venril Sathir, who has been slowly growing his power in Karnor Castle over the preceding years, took notice of these upstart outposts and decided he must take action. He had his agents take control of the outpost in the Overthere and ran it alongside the Dark Elves. He also sent agents to reoccupy the outpost of Varys in the swamp to the east so he could use it to keep an eye on the High Elves. With Venril Sathir ruling his army from Karnor, Trakannon ruling from his lair in Sebelis, and the Ring of Scale watching everything vigilantly from their home in Vishan's Peak. The stage is set for adventurers to pour onto the continent of Kunark as the era of the Ruins of Kunark expansion begins. Thanks for watching Part 2 of Lore of EverQuest, The Ruins of Kunark. I think I've covered most of the lore leading up to the expansion, although I'm certain I must have missed something. There's just so much to cover and so many different sources to draw from. I'm not done with Kunark yet, though. I do have a couple more videos planned for this era of EverQuest, so stay tuned for those. And with the Planes of Power going live on the Teak server, I'm going to have some content from that era coming up soon as well. Thanks for watching. Talk to you next time.